It's not calling you Josh Frydenberg, it's calling you Dosh Frydenberg.
Under the Coalition, taxes for hard-working Australians will always be lower.
You know, I don't hold a hose, mate, and I don't sit in the control room.
They're answers that only can come from Victoria, I'm afraid, because that's not my job.
But I ain't spending any time, though, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Well, g'day and welcome once again to the Two Jacks. It's episode 85, where we take a look at things going on in Australian politics and media, and then go and have a good look around the world to see what's going on there. And joining me, as usual, is Hong Kong Jack. G'day, mate.
G'day.
How's Hong Kong today?
Very sweaty.
Hot and sweaty, but not in a good way. But things pretty quiet over there at the moment.
Yeah. It's Hong Kong in August is like Melbourne or Sydney in January. The numbers of people thin out pretty markedly.
I read a very funny story from a sports journalist by the name of Andrew Ramsey, who tells a story of his first tour with international or the Australian cricket team. Only a few of them went across to the Hong Kong. I think they call it fives, a particularly abbreviated form of Australian cricket. And Andrew Ramsey found himself at the pointy end of a burner with a lot of Test cricketers who didn't trust him all that much. Very, very funny interaction with Mark Waugh. Andrew Ramsey, folks, if you're listening, the book is called The Wrong Line, and it's been published over 10 years ago. Peter Lawler put me onto it, actually, and it is a very funny treatment of what it's like to be a journalist on the road with the cricket teams.
Indeed.
Very funny guy. It's over 10 years old, but it's telling a story around that brilliant era of Australian cricket with a forward by Adam Gilchrist, and of course Shane Warne, Ricky Ponting, the Waugh brothers, all those great players around at the time.
If you want to laugh about what it's like to be visiting Hong Kong, you might have to scratch around to find this, but Barry Humphries had one of his all-time great characters, I think, a trade unionist called Lance Boyle,
yes,
who... it's all done from a hotel room in Hong Kong, and he's on the phone to his wife, and he's explaining the trip he's having from London and then back by a stopover in Hong Kong. It's a gem.
Yes, excellent. All right, well, let's get underway with the proper show. News poll and a range of polls are showing Labor's primary vote very, very low in the 30s, leading to much speculation of the Daily Mail variety, I must say, of a hung parliament after the next election. I don't buy that sort of stuff. The numbers have to fall very, very in a very particular way for a hung parliament to exist. But Labor's vote is perilously low, Jack, and of course we've had a month now of tax cuts, and they seem not to have bedded down very well for Labor.
No, there doesn't seem to. Perhaps the tax cut vote was already baked in before they actually arrived.
We'll look forward to more polling there. Where we've got the coalition in the news poll is, I think, 38 primary vote, and there may be some other issues, indeed, that Tony Burke will now find himself up against an independent, a Muslim spokesman for the community, well regarded, Jack?
Yeah, I believe so. I think that's a kind of a minor problem for them. Who's the bloke who looks like a boiled egg? James Campbell, who writes for the Melbourne Herald Sun. He identified some Melbourne seats that might be in play. And I think, he's a bit of a, I think his wife's a Liberal candidate, and he's very much in that camp. But I think he's right about that. But I think the government's problem is bigger than that.
I think it's a lot bigger than Victoria. If they had problems in Victoria, then they really got problems. But
they've got problems in Victoria. It's all over. As someone who's been around for a fair while, they're looking more like a Whitlam government than a Hawke government.
I love the historical reference points, but essentially this is a government that doesn't seem to have an overarching sort of philosophy. It doesn't seem to have or have communicated to the community what it's trying to do. And I think that's a problem. I think they've got serious problems in communications, probably too many people in comms hanging around various departments, including the Prime Minister's. I think he's got about a dozen, hasn't he? Comms advisors, way too many.
They should have a visit back to old Parliament House and look at the size of the Prime Minister's office in the old Parliament House, and somewhere between that and what they've got now is about the right number of people, but it's too many.
Just very quickly, Jack, on the Linda Reynolds defamation, the proceedings she's brought against Brittany Higgins and her partner. I see she said to her psychologist, or a psychologist gave evidence yesterday, saying that she believed she was undermined by Peter Dutton, who, of course, went on to replace her as Defence Minister. Probably the response from the psychologist giving evidence under oath in Perth yesterday was that they basically, that Reynolds said that she'd been undermined, and then they parked the issue. So we don't have any more details on that, other than to say Linda Reynolds seems to be proving herself as a bit of a mediocrity as a minister, and was it right that she was replaced, Jack?
Yeah, I've never been impressed by her, so I can see why they did replace her. Just on the Hawke Whitlam thing, the Hawke government, when it started, the first real thing it did was the Prices and Incomes Accords, to try and drive some growth into the economy, to get rid of the scourge of inflation. And they weren't just handing out money like this government's doing, or giving people tax cuts. That's a Whitlam-esque approach. Remember, Clyde Cameron gave 25% pay rises to all the public servants, and that just about killed the economy. Someone in the cabinet needs to be looking at history and saying, why can't we do something like Hawke and Keating did with the Prices and Incomes Accord to drive growth? Because that's the only way you'll fix the economy.
On this podcast, and have discussed it several times, one of the big issues facing Australia at the moment, particularly around our major cities, not just Sydney and Melbourne, is housing. And there is, a real sense that we are becoming a society of haves and have-nots in regard to housing, and perhaps the Albanese government should have created a summit around that. I know a lot of people might see that as a gimmick, but to put all stakeholders in the one space over a period of days, particularly around town planning, might have been a very good move, might still be a very good move.
Yeah, but that's what they're not doing, any of those kind of things. I mean,
they're a reactive government, aren't they? They are a reactive government rather than a proactive one.
That's exactly right. There's no doubt we've got an intergenerational problem with housing in Australia, because we've pumped so much money into the value of housing and made it the premier way for people to accumulate wealth. So much of the country's wealth is tied up in people's housing stock. So that's going to make it a really tricky problem to fix.
It is. So, it's one of those almost insoluble problems that you need to try and work through a solution that, in the understanding that a lot of people are going to be unhappy with any reforms that you bring forward. It's the nature of government really that things that come across Anthony Albanese's desk, most of which can't be solved to the satisfaction of 60 or 70% of Australians. It needs to be, a sort of a break even. Otherwise, our cities are going to become unlivable for young people.
Well, that was the beauty of the Prices and Incomes Accord. No one won out of the Price and Incomes Accord in the short term, but they sat down, the ACTU, the Business Council, and the government, state and federal, and said, "Well, this is our problem. This is what we think we should do to fix it." And that was hashed around and argued about. But the end result wasn't going to please any of those parties in the short term. In the end, it pleased all of them because they were all better off. But you've got to get to that first point of identifying the problem, making it public, and talking about it. But that means
I get that. I get the historical reference once again, but perhaps people don't really appreciate that the sort of issues that come across Anthony Albanese's desk can't be just sort of ameliorated or ticked off with the vast majority of Australians cheering him on. That there need to be some very hard decisions made particularly around housing. I would suggest that Labor's vote among the young is still reasonably high, but it is one of those things that they are leaking votes to the Greens over, because the Greens, for all their manifest shortcomings, actually have a housing policy. I mean, Labor has one that descends so far into the future that it can't be an issue that's raised in the election. It's just this slow build of social housing. It's a difficult topic, and Anthony Albanese's shown really no leadership over it. I guess because ultimately there won't be a lot of winners.
Yeah, that's right. They're afraid to take on the people who will be unhappy with the decision. I don't think the housing problem can be fixed with social housing. You couldn't possibly.
Oh no! I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting that there is a social housing component within any sort of within any sort of housing policy. And then you've got to deal with these issues that are entrenched in the Australian economy, as you said before. With tax benefits going to multiple people who own multiple houses, this sort of stuff was sort of tinkered with by Shorten, that any new housing would not be subject to those tax benefits, but that was repudiated by the electorate, and since then housing is just we're going to spend X amount of dollars on doing this. The problem with housing is that it goes across all three tiers of government, and you need to put everyone in the room, not just government, but also builders, investors, developers, residents, tenants, homeowners, everyone in the same room, and try and come up with a solution that's going to be a lot better for them. It might even just look like a little bit of window dressing, but a little bit of window dressing's got to be better than nothing, even if it was just that.
Well, I think it'd be more than window dressing, and it would be at least a start in addressing the problem. And in the same way, they need to look at what they can do. You don't fight inflation by giving people tax cuts. What you fight inflation by growth, and that means you've got to work out what you can do to improve the growth rate in Australia, to improve productivity in Australia.
All good points.
And that means looking at energy prices. How do you bring energy prices back down?
Yep, all good points. And these are points of pressure for the Albanese government that is looking increasingly lazy and reactive. And again, I think a lot of people view it with cynicism. The overarching narrative just doesn't exist. In terms of, why do you need a narrative? Well, you actually do need a narrative. It helps in your communication with the people to say, this is where we are now, this is where we want to be, and this is how we're going to get there. There's nothing
And
like that.
in terms of the practicalities, they could do what Elon Musk with their comms departments. Sack about 2/3 of them and start again.
There just seems to be a lot of communications people there, no doubt highly skilled, highly qualified, but in the end, they're only as good as their political masters allow them to be. And there's probably a profusion of these people around earning very, very good dough, sitting around with their feet up on the desk.
I'm sure
very,
there were.
very poor. I'm starting to see the Albanese government, with the exception of the exception of the Treasurer, he's the only exception I can think of. Maybe Murray Watt, who are out there being good communicators. Certainly, Albo's just not doing the job at the moment.
And with the Treasurer, he needs to be a good communicator because he hasn't got a good story to tell.
Yeah, maybe that's it too. All right. Well, when we're speaking about housing, the New South Wales Premier is having a good old-fashioned crack at it. Gee, they've had some joint meetings too with local government for not very much movement there, but there is the prospect of the sale of Rosehill Racecourse, which has caused a great deal of controversy, to open up a bit of land.
Did you have a glance at the New South Wales Parliamentary Committee of Inquiry into this?
Yeah, I did, and I saw some of the conduct at the meeting with Peter V'landys who's the head of racing and the NRL. Most annoyed about the treatment he received, particularly from one Mark Latham, who was pretty scathing.
Yeah, it was a bit of a circus. The thing. I don't think it did much for the reputation of the New South Wales Parliament.
Anything that involves the Legislative Council is pretty much going to end that way, isn't it?
Yeah, except for dinner behind the Speaker's chair. Behind the President's chair.
Always nice there. I'm off there my grand final week, actually, having dinner at the New South Wales President's dining room.
And for listeners,
but
for
that's
listeners,
the more important things.
For listeners, that's a little room just behind the president's chair, so she can duck out and vote as she pleases. It's very nice.
There's all sorts of little passageways around the old New South Wales Parliament. It's a very old building, of course. There are little secret passageways, and one goes to the Premier's office. And it was initially created, I don't know if it was created, but it certainly provided an excellent opportunity for one Edmund Barton to dash off if some of the angry husbands marched into the Parliament House in the day, because he was a bit of a serial adulterer, and he could just open up the bookcase and disappear. But back to this housing. It seems like Chris Minns is. I think he's one of our better politicians, better political leaders around the country. He seems to have a finger on the pulse, and we'll get to one of these issues in a minute. Look, Rosehill Racecourse, even if you whacked a number of high-storey buildings on it, is not going to solve the housing crisis in New South Wales. But it is a step in the right direction. A lot of horse racing people deeply opposed to it, Jack.
There are, yeah. Australia's biggest horse trainer trains out there, so he's not happy about it.
He's not happy about it at all. There's another racetrack, and I thought this was defunct, but there's Canterbury racetrack still running, Jack.
It is, yeah.
That's a lot of land for not a lot, Jack.
Yeah, I would have thought that was a better choice to whack up a few blocks of flats myself.
Yeah, well, look, Chris Minns is also, and this is kind of amusing, he's ordered the public service to return to work in the office, and it sort of raises all these work-from-home issues. Now, when I say he's ordered the public service back, the first thing we have to say is that most public servants work at the coalface: doctors, nurses, police officers, etc. But those
very hard to drive a bus remotely.
Yeah, right. So can't be done. But there are, of course, other people who work as sort of clerical admin, those sorts of functions. who do work from home. And this is not just a government or bureaucratic thing. This is going across the board with corporate Australia. Talking to a friend of mine yesterday who works for a big bank, and they have the same sort of things there. A lot of people, well, you see them, but you see them through Zoom meets and Microsoft groups and things like that. But they don't turn up at the workplace. And in this particular case, in this particular company, I won't say who it is, it's not discouraged, not actively discouraged to work from home. But you'll find that when it comes time to assessing the value of staff with a view to losing a few and saving a few bob, the corporations will look at those who essentially work from home and say, well, you're first cab off the rank.
Yeah. I've got no objection to people working from home or working from home in principle, but and the technology might be there one day to drive a bus remotely, but it just isn't there yet. But I can go back to my days as a young lawyer, and I can't imagine how I would have learnt what I know without being there to watch how it was done.
Okay, the first thing to say back to this, these are the sorts of points that Chris Minns talked about, that there was no mentoring, no, sort of the senior people taking the younger ones aside and showing them the ropes, this sort of stuff. There is no time frame on Chris Minns' work from home ban, and a lot of the senior bureaucrats have said, we'll get around to it.
Yes, so they've given Sir Humphrey answers. We're right behind you on this, Mr. Premier, yeah. And in the fullness of time, after the appropriate inquiries, we will think about instituting some sort of program to get to it. Yes.
Yeah, and Chris Minns is a smart bloke, and he knows that. He knew that already. So this was just a nice piece of politics anyway. If you just want to, listeners, if you just want to see a good political operator, he said, all right, I don't want to listen to work from home for our bureaucrats. They will be required to be in the office pretty much Monday to Friday. That we will understand that there are some people who will have exemptions, but for the most part, we want everyone back to work. And everyone goes, yeah, well, that's terrific. That's showing some real leadership. But of course, nothing will happen. Nothing's going to happen in the short term, at least.
Yeah, well, I think it's a nudge in the right direction. You're not going to fix this overnight, but you've got to push it in the right direction. I think it was good, not just good politics. I think it was good governance as well.
I looked at some of the commercial stock in around the Sydney CBD, and there is a vacancy rate around about 12%, which is, I think, as high as it's been for a while. It's not perhaps at a disastrous sort of state. Around the new Metro Rail projects, which are soon to open in Sydney, all of those places are all tenanted now. So there's no real crisis around the place. If you're running a cafe in the CBD, you might think it's a bit of a crisis, though. But we also find that a lot of those cafe proprietors who had the place down a Circular Quay or around Martin Place or around Chinatown or Central Station, they've sort of packed up and gone to the suburbs in many ways, So there's already been that response to it.
Yeah.
The other thing I'd say is that Sydney is a city, a CBD, without a real heart. Now, Melbourne draws people into its CBD through what's available there, the bars, the cafes, the restaurants, the meeting places for people. But Sydney doesn't have that. And if you go into Sydney CBD on a Saturday afternoon, for example, it's pretty desultory. There aren't many people around. Sydney's a very sort of provincial place, and the CBD tends not to have a lot of people around it. There are exceptions to that around the Rocks and and then going out to places like Potts Point and Newtown and things like that. But the CBD, it always occurred to me, was a pretty soulless sort of place in Sydney.
Melbourne was exactly the same. As soon as 12:30 came on a Saturday and the big stores closed, it was empty on Saturday afternoons and Sundays.
Most people be going to the sport at the G or the sport at the, they're going to Flemington or, those sorts of things. So
the difference now in Melbourne is that Melbourne has quite a large population of residents, and that keeps the thing ticking over all weekend.
Well, see, Sydney does too, particularly up around the Chinatown central end, the northern end. A lot of apartments there where a lot of students live, a lot of people enjoy living in the city, but it's not a vibrant CBD at all in the weekends, during the weekends. I don't know.
I don't know what the figures are, but my last time I looked, the figures of residents in the CBD in Melbourne was much higher. And it's much more spread around the CBD rather than just around Chinatown. And that look, this is all relatively recent. I can remember a pal of mine bought and renovated a tiny little warehouse in the CBD. This is back in the early 90s, and we all thought he'd gone mad. It was a very eccentric thing to do. And it was at the time.
It was,
but now it's commonplace.
Yeah, now it's common. Look, and I live in the country, but I look at that sort of lifestyle and think, that would be good in Melbourne. It would be good in Melbourne. In Sydney, I'm not so sure. You can really fire a gun down George Street, and not that I suggest you do that, but you could fire a gun down George Street on a Saturday afternoon, and no prospect of injuring anybody. So I think it's more
probably wouldn't even hit a tram because they're probably stopped.
The light rail's really cooking now. And it is one reason to get people in. You've got the metro opening soon, which I think will be a huge game changer. The first stage of that out to Marrickville from the northern beaches underground through the harbour and into Martin Place and a number of other new rail stations that are all, as I say, booked up, tenanted with cafes and things like that. Martin Place is going to be the new hub of the city with this. But, it's one of those things that New South Wales has not been as good at as the Victorians over the journey. I think they, even now when you talk about liquor licensing, Jack, the cost of getting a liquor licence in New South Wales is, I'm not even going to put a figure on it, but many, many times more expensive than it is in Victoria, where you can apply for a bar licence for 30 people and pay $1,000 or a little bit more than $1,000. So, licenses for the pubs in the CBD cost you $250,000.
A lot of cities around the world have spent a fortune trying to develop a nightlife precinct. Meanwhile, the city of Sydney destroyed theirs for nothing.
Well, look, we've got just a little bit of time, so let's look at the history of that, Jack. And there were a number of violent offences occurring at the Cross, King Hit type offences, and there had been a fair amount of hand wringing about how we brought a stop to that. It's an awful crime and left a number of very young people either very severely injured or dead. And it occurred one more time in the middle of what we might call a silly season, early January, and I'm struggling for the year, but I'm going to say around about 2010. And the Daily Telegraph and the Sydney Morning Herald outdid each other to say the Premier at the time, Barry O'Farrell, must do something to stop this. They really just were trying to outdo each other, as I say, the two major papers in the city. O'Farrell's first reaction was, look, I'm not going to react to this. But it just kept going on and on and on through that month of January. So finally they came to this decision of lockouts. And they basically killed a multi-billion-dollar, you might call it a red light district. That's probably a bit over the top, but King's Cross, they just killed it. It was just overnight, just destroyed it. Oxford Street, destroyed overnight. The Rocks pretty much, I think, was exempt for a while. All it did effectively was just to push all the crowds, the late night partiers who want to go to drink booze at 4 o'clock in the morning, pushed it out to Newtown and Double Bay.
Yeah. Well, you and I both lived in the neighbourhood, shall we say, and it was a terrific place, I think. But, they wrecked it.
They did wreck it. There's sort of a little bit of, shall we say, green shoots around the Cross at the moment, but now it's become a NIMBY location. So you've got all these sort of gentrified Potts Point residents now saying, "Oh, I don't want any nightclubs in my suburb." It's just lobbed basically to a red light district that had been around for 80 years.
It used to be funny. Potts Point and King's Cross were interchangeable suburbs in a sense. We lived in Victoria Street, and if you walked along Victoria Street, all the places that were backpackers, hostels, and all that sort of stuff, their address was always given as King's Cross, right? Because people knew about that worldwide. Anybody who was in a residential block, it was always called Potts Point, and they were side by side. But your friend Duncan McNabb said on Twitter the other day that there is a kebab shop going back on the corner of Bayswater and Darlinghurst. You remember that? You would have. Sometimes there were occasions. I must
pizza
confess,
slice, $2 pizza slice.
There were occasions in my past when a $2 pizza slice or a quick kebab on the way home was a medical necessity. That is one of your green shoots, I suppose. If the kebab house is going back in, that's a good thing.
Oh, only until the residents of Potts Point kick up a fuss about all the noise, Jack. Imagine moving into a red light district 10 years ago and saying, "I don't like this anymore." I mean, it's like people who live under or buy a place under a fight bath and start complaining about it.
Yeah. Do you remember the bourbon and beef there in the Cross?
Bourbon and beef, just absolutely dripping with history.
Yeah, and it was a genuine 24/7 place. Yeah. So much so that when they decided to close it for some renovations, they realised they couldn't find the front doors, which had been taken off the hinges and stored in the basement to allow easier access. And they had to dig them out, dust them off, and put them back up again so the builders could get to work.
Bernie Horton, yeah. Wasn't it? Bernie Horton, of course, and he was a CIA boy, and there was lots of shenanigans went on in the bourbon and beef state. When I first moved up to Sydney, folks, I'd go and grab myself some breakfast. I wasn't living far away from the Cross. I'd drive up to the Cross, and I'd just park the car outside the burb, and just watch the punch-ups at about 6 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, and you could pick up the Melbourne papers at the news agent.
Yeah,
across
do
the
all
road.
that, and if you sat in the car having a coffee and a muffin or something like that, you could watch some of those blokes pouring out of the bourbon and often having a bit of a blue with the bouncers on the way out. It was a great way to spend an early Sunday morning. More serious stuff here, Jack. Besides our rather tepid attempts at town planning. The justice system, the rather famous now Federal Court Justice Michael Lee has bemoaned the fact that not even people with relative wealth can access the legal system now, that it is beyond the scope of the vast majority of Australians. Lee said, "It's very much a concern to me that not only the average middle-class Australian, but even the quite wealthy Australian is alienated from the legal system in the sense that they really can't afford to litigate. And that's a failure of the system," he said, "a single failure of the system." It doesn't. It's absolutely right. I mean, if you go and have a crack at someone at a reasonably high level, particularly when you get around a Supreme Court, well, 50 grand, 50 grand's basically your entry fee. So what do we do to change that, Jack? Pay lawyers less?
Well, no, that would be a terrible thing. I think we have to rethink some aspects of dispute resolution. Yeah, as I would put it, we've got to provide access to dispute resolution that works well and is enforceable but costs less.
So more mediation, that sort of thing, directing people to mediation, those sorts of things.
Yeah, I haven't got a blueprint for this, but I think we've got to go back and think about it again a little bit. He also raised the question of what happened during COVID with the remote trials, and he made the very good point that as a former litigator himself, he would want to see the whites of their eyes while he was cross-examining them, witnesses. So
yes.
He didn't think that good. And I can say I had to get used to doing remote hearings in the early 2000s because I was on the Refugee Tribunal, and the cost to the government of flying members and staff to Christmas Island or Port Hedland or Woomera was just horrific. So they started us using...
Gee, they wouldn't have had the technology there, would they? Were you actually able to see the applicants?
Well, like a lot of things, the first two iterations of the technology we had were fairly terrible, but within I did it for about 5 years before I left, I think, and by the end it was pretty good. And you get better at it. It's like a lot of things you've got to learn to do. You can do it, but
it's not so much the court costs that are the killer. I've been looking at a case of down in Melbourne where a self-represented litigant, member of the freedom movement, Monica Smith, is suing the state of Victoria Police, over her arrest during the lockdown period. And it's not so much the cost of operating a court. I mean, there's no jury in this trial, so you can forget about that. The court costs of, not insignificant, but the real costs come with having a small army of lawyers on the other side. In this case, a firm that's contracted to perform to act essentially as defendants for the state of Victoria. And we tried to figure out. I tried to figure out the cost of this case, which is extended now. There's been a few breaks, but let's say there've been, I think, 10 or 12 hearing days so far. Might run to 15. And I'm thinking there's got to be 300 grand's worth of costs outside of the court costs, Jack.
300 grand in costs she would be ordered to pay if she's unsuccessful.
Yes. Well, I guess it would determine if the state made that application, Jack. But wouldn't
if she's bought the case and they ask for on the questions of cost, the judge would award those costs against her.
And 300 large, and this is in the district court, county court in Victoria, same status, and a 15-day hearing, just regardless of outcome. We don't want to jump ahead there, but that's 300 large. That's my estimate. My lawyer friend said, "Oh, you're a bit high with that," but it's certainly in the ballpark.
It wouldn't have been a figure that would surprise me if I read it. 300. Another thing that's changed is that judges used to be a little bit more active in deciding what questions in a trial, in a dispute, were relevant and what weren't relevant.
Oh, you should see this one, Jack, with the self.
That's very hard with the self-represented.
And the court is bending over backwards to
be fair,
give her a sense of
as it should.
Natural justice.
as it should. But I just mean in ordinary commercial litigation. You've probably seen it around Phillip Street in Sydney where they have these trolleys with about 50 or 60 lever arch files that they're wheeling into court for a commercial dispute. And really most of these commercial disputes, they turn on one or two or three points. And instead, they're discovering all of these documents, which is great for the lawyers. You make money on doing all of this.
Well, it's $300 an hour to look at a video or to review and copy a document and read it and analyse it.
Yeah, but judges used to be tougher on saying this is not relevant to the issue at all, and they've gotten soft on that.
Lots of things happen there, but if you get dudded, Jack, in this community, in the Australian community, genuinely dudded by a company, you really don't have a lot of recourse unless you're prepared, unless your loss is so significant that you're prepared to cover at least the 50 large to get yourself rolling.
Which is why, of course, if you're dudded by a company, people tend to use social media, etc., to embarrass the company into doing the right thing.
Well, I've seen too the rise, getting a little bit off track, but you know the Google review, that runs around restaurants and even
TripAdvisor, etc. Yeah.
Yeah, well, we've found recently that people who make Google reviews are subject to defamation proceedings, Jack. That's an odd thing. All right. I don't know that there's too much answer to that other than just to start taking them and pay lawyers at, let's say, look, I'd put them up there with sort of assisted care workers, somewhere like that, about $28 an hour. I think that'll solve it. Sort of things solve a lot of things, quite frankly. In another story, Jack, that caught my eye, former AFP Commissioner Mick Kelty has given up his Order of Australia honour. No reasons were given for this. According to The Guardian, said the former Australian Federal Police Commissioner Mick Kelty has relinquished his Order of Australia honour. He actually had to write to the Governor-General and it had to be formalised by the Governor-General. It would seem, although it's speculation, because Kelty has not provided a reason, but it would seem that it is related to him passing information that he received from serving AFP officers while he was in retirement that warned Ben Roberts-Smith that he was about to be subject of a criminal investigation.
I think that much of it is public, that did happen, and that Ben Roberts-Smith, it is said, took some actions as a result of that
He has
warning.
pretty much acknowledged it, Jack. He has acknowledged it.
That Ben Roberts-Smith invested in a couple of burner phones, for instance, et cetera, so that they couldn't
so he knew in the old criminal jargon, Jack, he knew he was tropical because the former head of the Australian Federal Police had contacted him, and this is again quoting from the Guardian, in a statement to the 9 journalists, Chris Masters and Nick McKenzie, Kelty said he did not know the former soldier at the time, that's Ben Roberts-Smith, but contacted him at the request of someone in the security industry who had worked alongside Roberts-Smith at 7 Group Holdings, where he forged a civilian career after retiring from the Army. In June last year, Judge Anthony Basenko found that they had met the required level of proof that Roberts-Smith was involved in the murders of 4 unarmed civilians while serving in Afghanistan. Basenko found that Kelty told Roberts-Smith at the 20 June meeting he could not meet him again because police had received referrals about him and that Roberts-Smith actively tried to avoid police detection after Kelty told him about the referrals. So it would seem, but we don't know, it would seem that is the reason why Mick Kelty has voluntarily ceded his Order of Australia, the highest honour an Australian can receive, Jack.
Well, second highest. AC, I think, is the highest one now.
Oh, what's the AC? What do they make you Pope?
It's the companion of the Order of Australia. But I think
Who gets those, Jack? If Mick Kelly's missed out, who gets those? What, prime ministers?
Yeah, I think that
Governors General?
Those former prime ministers who will accept them.
Well, there's only one who didn't. Or has Gillard? Yes, Gillard received hers, didn't she?
Yeah, I think she thinks she's taken
She has. Yeah, I love Keating's statement about that. He basically just said, I think these awards are made for ordinary Australians who do extraordinary things. And I think that's where our honours system, we must get into that, Jack, at a reasonable time. Obviously, our honours system, we've just missed the most recent ones at the King's birthday, but also Australia Day. It's a very opaque system, Jack. Let's put it that way.
Oh, I only read them down as far as the H, Joe, just in case they've made an error and given one of us one.
Well, I'm not expecting anything anytime soon. Of course, you are well advised months before if you're going to receive it, and you have the opportunity to knock it back. Very disturbing story that you won't have seen much of in the media, listeners. Paedophilia in the Victorian Education Department. We've got historical child sex offending that, by my estimate is going to cost the state of Victoria literally hundreds of millions of dollars in compensation. Offending was rife in both the secondary and primary system. When complaints were made, senior teachers, principals, district inspectors contrived with more senior department officials to move the offender on from one school to the next, often schools in regional and rural Victoria. I won't go into very much.
Particular cluster around the southeast suburbs too, around Beaumaris.
So I was just going to talk about. Well, we'll do that now. There was a judicial investigation conducted around Beaumaris Primary School, which was very limited in scope to that school and what offenders were there. And I think at one time there were 3 pedophile teachers there, and ultimately about 4 or 5 went through the school. And then on, sadly, to in the most part to rural and regional schools of Victoria, out of sight, out of mind type transfers, where they would offend against unsuspecting children, unsuspecting parents. One case, Jack, a fellow by the name of Bill Allen, now deceased, a particularly prolific child sex offender. He was also a sort of leader or chief spokesman for a sort of boy love group in Australia. His name was Bill Allen, if I didn't say that already. He was in the Navy. He was in the Royal Australian Navy, and was dishonourably discharged there on the basis that they found he was essentially a psychopath. So he was discharged from the Navy. So what next to do? Does some teacher training. And in 1966 is prosecuted for child sex offending within the state system. He was given a bond, which is disgraceful in itself. So no conviction was recorded. But he lost his teaching certificate, but retained it again in 1971. There is correspondence between Allen and the department at the time where he's saying, oh, look, here's my teacher number, and a state teacher would have a number attributed to them. Here's my old number, but don't use that one. Generate a new one for me, and if you want to speak to me about any of this, please, please do. And ultimately he was reissued a new a teaching certificate with a new number and went on to offend like you wouldn't believe. So I mean, I can say that there's all of that. I mean, Russell Jackson at the ABC has been doing some excellent work on that, and without giving too much away, Russell says, he's just overwhelmed by it, because everywhere you look, there's another 10 victims there. There's another 20 victims there. I've been looking at the secondary system and an offender by the name of Peter Sutton, and he's never been charged with any offence. with any criminal offence, and I've got to say I'm not quite sure why. I'm obtaining his teaching records, but what I do know about him was that he was moved on from Rosebud High School. This is all down Frankston Way. Moved on from Rosebud High School. At least a dozen complaints about his conduct there from parents. There is information that some of those parents went to police, but there is no report of or record of a report being made to police. Sutton was then moved on to Monterey High School with an instruction given from one principal, for the principal at Rosebud High School to the principal at Monterey High School, that he should not be involved in the school production, because that would give him an opportunity. He was a drama teacher, by the way, Australian history and English. That would give him an opportunity to have access to children outside of the classroom. The principal, I'm told, at Monterey would try and keep him away from boys, but and often would leave him teaching a classroom of girls, and the girls themselves, a number of them have spoken to me, said he was abusive, not in a sexual way, but just nasty and horrible. And then after I think about a 7 or 8 year period at Monterey High School, he was moved on to Ballum Park Technical School, spent a number of years there again, I'm going to say 3 off the top of my head, before his teaching career finally ended after more complaints were made by parents. He had an MO of photography. He would encourage young boys, we're talking 14, 15-year-olds in high school, to dress up in sexualised sort of clothing. Shaving cream was another thing that seemed to be a constant. He also claimed that he could hypnotise kids and made attempts to do so on a number of occasions. Often the photography would lead to acts of gross indecency where he would be masturbating, or indeed he would commit sexual assaults. Now, he's never been charged with any offence. I've got no problem with saying this, by the way. And Peter Sutton wants to sue you and me, Jack. Good luck.
I was just going to say, I hope this bloke's dead. I was just, as you were reading this litany out, I say, I hope this bloke's dead.
Oh, mate, I've got no problem with him. We're about to do him. We're about to get stuck into him in the Australian.
Yeah,
a few little things need to fall into place there. But here's my issue with all of this. Now, he is subject of 12 litigated claims, at least, by students at Rosebud, Monterey. I'm not sure about Ballum Park Tech, but he definitely offended there, and that led to him leaving teaching finally. And then, of course, Jack, because no one knew about this guy's propensity, there was no community knowledge, no warnings given, he went on to run a youth culture magazine, rock music, all that sort of stuff, where he would employ young writers and then abuse them. So my question is, what's the difference between the Victorian Education Department and what we understand as the Catholic churches and other institutions, the Anglican Church, the Salvation Army, Swimming Australia, we could go on, all of these institutions that were found during the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse, their habit of simply moving pedophiles on to new communities, new classrooms, with no warning, and onto new groups of unsuspecting children.
You'd have to wonder what the McClellan Royal Commission was doing not looking into this, wouldn't you?
That is a very good question. I guess the response would be that the Royal Commission had received no complaints, which I find very difficult. I don't know, but I'd find it very difficult to understand, given the sheer number of people that I'm currently dealing with at the moment who are just wanting to come forward to tell their stories. Sutton was the subject of, and you'll remember this as an old Melburnian, Jack, an old resident of Melbourne, Darren Hinch's current affairs show on Channel 7.
And he
would have his shame file. Yeah, so he made the shame file. And my understanding is that not long after, and to be honest, victims were quite offended, quite embarrassed, quite humiliated, because Hinch hadn't told any of them that they were going to be the subject of, his grandstanding, which is just dreadful. But I'm told that police took a bit of an interest in him. I'm told since that they raided his home over around 2 years ago and seized a number of photographs or photographic albums. But here we are 2 years later, and he has not been charged. He's an elderly fellow now, and I'm chasing him up to get some comment from him. But all of this is going to cost the people of Victoria indirectly about $300 million. We might remember that there were some fairly senior people in the education department in and around this time, fairly famous names, including a Herd, a former president of the Essendon Football Club and grandfather of Coach James. The issue was, Jack, that the education department didn't have a policy on this. So no one knew what to do when it arose. There was no policy, and you would have principals contriving with district inspectors, and I don't think they have district inspectors anymore, and district inspectors communicating up the hierarchy to the more senior members of the education department, and it was just like, oh, well, move him on. Just move him on to another place.
Which is, it's a very familiar story. It's what the religious organisations of various kinds did as well.
It's not as if there are, this is a case of a handful of victims. So we're looking at hundreds.
Mm.
The state of Victoria, like most states, I think all states, Jack, is a model litigant. Tell me what a model litigant is.
Well, that's testing my memory a little bit.
I'll help you out. It's basically provide guidelines for best practice for government agencies in civil litigation. So don't delay, don't obfuscate, don't mess people around. And I'm told by the lawyers that despite assuming the title of being a model litigant, the state of Victoria is not a model litigant.
This has been a common thing for governments of various kinds to declare themselves, we're going to be model litigants. As someone who sat across the other side of the table doing negotiations with them, I didn't ever notice a remarkable difference between model litigants and the other ones.
All right. Now, we are going to skip ahead now and go overseas into Bangladesh, Jack, where an elected Prime Minister has basically had to flee the country.
Hopped on the chopper and went to India.
And she's a Hindu, I believe, Jack.
I'm not sure about that. Bangladesh is a more important country than a lot of people understand, I think. It's 170 million Bangladeshis, and it's a much bigger economy than Pakistan. Bangladesh is the second biggest economy in South Asia, and it's been an economic success story. Pakistan's many more people, about 270 million, nearly 100 million more people. But the GDP of Bangladesh is bigger, its exports are bigger, and its growth rate's about 3 times what Pakistan is. It's a real success story, despite the fact that it's had a difficult government
we've heard
record.
Stories. I mean, adulterous women set for stoning and all this kind of Sharia law excess.
Yeah, and there have been like two big political parties who've run Bangladesh since independence in 71. The Awami League, which is, I think, is Urdu for the People's League, more or less. And
that's where the Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina,
the most recent Prime Minister, the one who's fled, she was part of that.
She's a member of the AL. We'll call them that, Awami League.
And the other big group is the BNP, the Bangladesh National Party, which is these days is a bit of an amalgamation of opposition parties with, I think, a little bit of Jamaat Islamiyah, the strident Islamic group who want Sharia law in Bangladesh, but they're a very much minority. It is a Muslim country.
But they are powerful in some of the provinces, aren't they?
They are in the rural areas, yeah. And it's the chap who's been brought back from Europe to be the interim prime minister is what's his name? Muhammad Yunus. He's the chap who won a Nobel Prize for starting what's called the Grameen Bank, which was a small bank which provided loans, but mainly to women in often in rural Bangladesh to set up tiny enterprises, micro businesses, if you like. And that was very successful and raised a lot of people out of poverty. And he seems to be a pretty good type of person.
Seems like a very good type of person, but the problem is, Jack, he wasn't elected.
No.
So it's a pretty sketchy sort of treatment of the people. Has there been much sort of protests and rallies? I have seen some international news.
It's a little bit sketchy at the moment. There are allegations that the protesters are attacking Hindus, and I've certainly seen photos of Muslims standing guard outside Hindu temples, etc., etc. So, but the reporting's a bit unclear about all of that because most of the reporting's done by people who have a vested interest in one side or the other, or one of the three sides, I suppose.
Pretty opaque
a bit opaque
there too.
Yeah. But it is one to watch. But certainly the history of politics in Bangladesh has been a very messy. When they changed government, which they've done fairly regularly, swinging backwards and forwards between the Awami League and the BNP. The winning government promptly rounds up the leadership of the losing government and puts them in jail or kills them. So that's not a good thing. But despite that, the country's been a very successful one, in my view.
The AL is actually, even though they were elected, they're going through that process right now, actually, with a number of their members being rounded up and disappeared, if you like.
Yeah.
Which is not quite a word, but it'll do. All right, Ukraine, Jack. The Ukrainian army commenced an incursion into Russian territory. Vladimir Putin got very, very upset and threatened the West. I did a bit of reading on this yesterday, and I don't know that we could call it a game changer, but it does break down that quagmire of very sort of microscopic sort of Russian advances on the eastern Ukraine border and the disputed territories around there. The Russian army is actually making advances, but they are very, very slow due to the fact that they've essentially got a fully conscripted force fighting now. And very few veterans of previous wars Russia's been involved in around. So you've got probably a very reluctant force making very small gains. And in the meantime, the Ukraine, I think, if I might be so bold as to read into the politics of this, making this incursion into Russian territory to say, hey, Europe, US, etc., around the world, don't forget about us. Don't forget we're still here. Don't forget we're still fighting the Russians, and we're doing okay despite serious limits.
Yeah, well, I think support for Ukraine was dropping off And I think this looks like it might be partly logistical and partly political.
Yeah, and probably good morale for people living in Kyiv and elsewhere who are being bombarded on more or less daily basis. We'll keep an eye on that too. Ukraine, it's not a small country, but it is a minnow compared to Russia in military terms. I mean, part of my reading involved just reminding myself, or just being reminded, that this war was, according to Putin, was going to be over in 3 days. It's gone a bit longer than that. All right, the United States. Well, where do we start there? But we have to be quick. We are looking at a real bounce. We mentioned this last week. A real bounce for Kamala Harris. Since we recorded, she has named. I think we just came in because she'd just been named her VP a nomination. The Minnesota governor. Help me with his first name, Jack.
Tim Walz.
Tampon Tim. That was the immediate response from the Trumpers. And it seems overall to be, I know that there's been some stolen valor sort of stuff mentioned about him. He seems very folksy. He seems the sort of guy who will sort of deliver them votes in the Midwest where perhaps Kamala couldn't as a California Democrat. The polls are telling us, that she's in front. The polls are telling us that she's in front in enough battleground states to win. And that's where we sort of stand at on the 13th of August as we record this. Long way to go. We are a week away, less than a week away from the DNC in Chicago, which is going to be a massive love-in, and you'd expect a bit of a bounce again, really. And then in terms of outside of the sort of usual rallies, it'll be the now agreed upon ABC hosting the debate on September 10th.
Nate Silver says it's 50-50. She's not as far in front, or she's not in front like, say, Biden was in 2020 at this stage. One of the things the bounce has told us is what a terrible candidate Joe Biden was.
Well, I think it's also saying, Jack, that I think there's a great sense of ennui among Americans over the choices between the two old men, and I think the South Carolina governor and an opponent of Trump's in the primaries, Nikki Haley, got it about right when she said in February of this year, the party that drops their 80-year-old candidate first will win.
She could be,
we're a fair way from that, but there is. I just think there's a sense of sort of fresh air around the election that wasn't there 2 months ago.
Yeah, I think I said this a few weeks ago that Trump has a high floor and a low ceiling. That there are a lot of baked-in people who will vote for Trump no matter what he does, and there are a lot of people who won't vote for Trump no matter what he does, or whoever the opponent is.
There seems to be a much stronger. Trump would call them rhinos, but sort of never Trumpers within the Republicans who are actually putting their lot in with Kamala Harris.
Neither of those,
and he looks rattled. He does look rattled.
Yeah, neither of those groups are a majority. So, the relevant, but the numbers in the middle are small by historical terms. That is, the battleground area isn't as big as it would usually be. He does look rattled. He looks like a boxer who wants to get into a scrap, and his opponent's dancing around the ring, and he can't get into the scrap that he wants to get into. That's how he looks to me.
Well, if you listen to the Cephs, Jack, about 1.8% of American voters will determine the election. It's that small, and that easy. What I'm seeing with a lot of the polling, and a good long look at it yesterday, was that support among young voters was really comprehensive, and support among independent voters. This is the real crux of the matter, that independent voters were opting in for Kamala. A long way to go. I tend to agree with you that it's around about even money. In fact, if we look at some of the big betting agencies in the United States, they still have, and forgive me, folks, I haven't looked at it for a couple of days, they still have Trump installed as a very tepid favourite.
Yeah, a couple of them now have a couple of the
Australian agencies and and things like in the UK. They're smaller pools, so they're reflecting a trend.
Yeah, they're reflecting momentum.
They are. They are exactly
and we didn't
right.
make that plain. What they are saying is a very tiny favouritism for Kamala Harris. But, but the bigger pools in America still have Trump as favourite.
And that's because there's been a lot of money invested going back through June, July. Been a lot of money invested in Trump.
Yeah. Anyway, it's a long way to go.
Long way to go, and lots can go wrong. Like I say, DNC, major love incoming in Chicago next week, and then the big moment will be after that. The big moment will be that we can, one of the ones that we can actually predict will be the debate, and we'll see how she gets on there. Yes, I must say that the Musk-Trump interview that Elon Musk said wasn't an interview, it was just a conversation. They started out with $8 million, and it was a bit like you remember the launch of DeSantis' campaign? It apparently collapsed. Musk claimed that there was a DDoS, or distributed denial of service attack on Twitter that prohibited big numbers joining, and I think they had a potential 8 million audience, and they ended up allowing about 700,000 people through. That's just news that's come to hand, so I apologise if it's not quite right, but it would appear that I guess long-awaited for some Musk-Trump conversation was a bit of a fizzer. All right. And just by the way, Jack.
I would just say about the Trump-Musk conversation is that there will be a lot of people who will listen to that or will listen to repeats of it, but almost all of them will have already made up their mind how they're going to vote. So
it'll be Trumpers, wouldn't they? Most of them.
No. There'll be anti-Trumpers who will listen to it as well. But most of the people,
there won't be many.
Most of the people listening to it from either side will be people who are listening to it to have their prejudices confirmed rather than to find out something new. Because that 1.8% that you talk about are the people who don't much care about politics.
Yeah, that's right. Meanwhile, Jack, wine fraud. It's the worst kind of fraud, isn't it? Wine fraud.
It's the funniest kind of fraud.
Well, this is in Taiwan. Tell us all about it, Jack.
There's discovered a millionaire collector over there has been selling his wine, and this was, as it always happens with these wine fraud, it was detected almost by accident. There was the chap in California years ago, I think he was from Indonesia, who'd sold $100 million worth of wine in California, almost all of which was fraudulent, and sold it to all the rich and well-connected and the wine experts, and everyone just happily paid the money. But it's happened again in Taiwan, and these things always amuse me. For a time here, I'm told that there was a market in empty bottles of high-quality wines in Hong Kong because
stick a candle in them. Stick a candle in them, and off you go.
They could whip them across the border, fill them with any old nonsense, and recap them and sell them into what in those days was a booming market in expensive wine in China. And given that I'm told by friends who've done business over there, you'd be sitting around the round table with the lazy Susan in the middle and having the banquet, and out would come a bottle of Grange, for instance, and they'd slurp it around all the glasses and then put Sprite on top of it. So it didn't really matter if it wasn't really Grange.
It probably wasn't.
So one to be aware of. But
Yeah.
the funny thing is, really, it's the wealthy and the experts who just are suckers for this stuff.
Well, the other side of that coin is that very small vintners in Australia are producing red wines that, if they get the thumbs up from the right judges, and there's really only about 2 or 3 very powerful people in terms of how they grade wine, and they really love strong, fruity, bold reds, which tend not to keep, as you might know. You probably know more about this than I do. They tend not to keep, so they're not going to be any good 10 years down the track. But if they get the thumbs up, and this might be a vintner that produces 400 bottles a year, and if they get the thumbs up, those bottles can all of a sudden be something. You buy them in an Australian bottle for $20, $25. But if they get the thumbs up, they're sort of going for $4,000 or $5,000 in Singapore restaurants.
There's a chap called Robert Parker, an American.
There's your man.
Yeah, he sort of ruined the Shiraz market in Australia by giving these wines, 95s and 98s and all that sort of stuff. So everyone tried to make a Shiraz that was so big that it would jump out of the bottle and belt the crap out of you.
And be no good in 6 months' time.
And so it was an unfortunate fashion for a while. I hope it's diminishing.
It probably has diminished. I did write about it for Time magazine, Jack, long time ago now, about 15 years ago. All right. United Kingdom. Well, geez, we had a stink about this. There's an order from Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood that said anyone wearing a mask to a riot would be prosecuted. What happens if they've got some respiratory conditions, Jack?
They should have done this in Hong Kong. It would have been our riots would have been over much faster if they had.
Well, they seem to be over in the UK substantially now too, and there have been. We talked about jail sentences last week. I did follow those that have been convicted, included a 69-year-old man. What are you doing, mate? Another bloke.
That's a young man, I've got to tell you.
Jesus Christ! Well, he was. I just have to check, but he was given a jail sentence. It was relatively short compared to the others handed out for turning.
At 69, I'd just say he's a young chap sowing his wild oats.
He had a cosh on him, and it took 3 police officers to restrain him and arrest him.
Did you look at almost all of the people who were convicted and sent to jail?
Well, they're not the master race, are they? They're not the master race.
They had a list of priors as long as your arm.
The first bloke to go down, he was in his 50s. He expressed deep regret. He said he'd let down his wife, he'd let down his family. Very, very remorseful. I got about 3 years in the slammer, and then they ran through his priors. Very violent human being. So he's let his wife and his family down again, not for the first time. You looked out there clearing all that up, and I'll be over in the UK just to check things out over there. Well, over to sport, Jack. Lots to cover in sport, of course, with the Olympic Games wrapping up. But we'll start with Tasmania, and they have now signed their 200,000th member of the AFL. Of the AFL team, which hasn't played a game yet, set to enter in the competition in 2028, the Tasmanian Devils. But it's pretty easy if you only charge people $10.
Yeah.
Well, you're not getting anything for your $10. Not as if you're going to go and see them play.
This is where all of the club membership numbers don't really stack up with the old historical ones. There was a time when if you bought a club membership, you got entry to all the home games. Now all the clubs have various gradations on that.
I'm a member at Carlton, and I get access to tickets when they play in Sydney, and so I pay a lot less than others do who go to Carlton home games on a regular basis at Marvel Stadium and the MCG. Look, all the same, it's going rather well. The problem they've got is how the hell are they going to build that stadium for the money that they say it's going to cost? Because the money it's going to cost is nowhere near what it will cost. A roof stadium is, and they say, well, the Tasmanian government is basing their costings on, I think it's the AFL have sent out, and they're prepared to contribute. I think it's 60% of about $700 million. But everyone who looks at that stadium plan says there's no way you can build it for under $1 billion. So it probably means that the people of Tasmania are going to be on the hook for about $400 million because the AFL, the AFL, I think, have weighed in about $50 million. So it's a light touch.
Yeah. The stadium is their sticking point down there. I think they're going to have to rethink that and fix it. And so is the AFL.
What's wrong with Bellerive? I mean, do a bit of work.
Well, what's wrong with using a combination of Bellerive and Launceston?
Launceston, absolutely right. And except to say that what the AFL doesn't want, and this is why they want a roof stadium, Jack, and they fear the Tasmanian winter. They don't want this, the AFL, the pinnacle of this particular code, to be played in the slop. That's it. That's why they want a roof stadium.
Well,
all right. Well, they got a little bit.
We've both seen a few games at the, what's it called, the UTAS Stadium in Launceston. That seems fine.
Yeah, look, it's probably a good. You'd be happy with it if you played Ballarat or Bendigo, and it needs some work. Both of them need some work. Pitch up a few stands. You're going to be able to do that for $600 million. But I know some of our listeners, Tasmanian listeners, are deeply fond of their of the thought of their state participating in the AFL. I think it's a great idea, the idea of the competition expanding. However, that will give us 19 teams, Jack, and a bye. And I don't think too many club presidents around the country are going to want 19 teams, Jack.
Well, they're stuck with it now.
Well, I think there'll be one or two that are encouraged to go interstate, and I think North Melbourne will be in the gun. So let's hope their footy department really improves because, and they look to be, because this is, and this goes for my mob too, Carlton and clubs like St Kilda. It's not a good time to be vulnerable.
No, it's not.
All right. The AFL is, well, I'll just quickly say, Melbourne played Port Adelaide at the G, and actually, I mean, it was season over for the Demons beforehand. They have really no chance of making the 8. And only 18,000 people turned up, Jack.
And it was the same at their previous home ground, less than 20. So what I want to know is it must be a good ski season in Melbourne.
It's apparently very good at the moment.
Yeah, okay. Well, that might explain.
The AFL has brought in the wildcard round. So how does it work? 7 plays 10, 8 plays 9 in a final qualifier. Your thoughts on that, Jack?
Ridiculous idea.
I reckon if you're not good enough to finish 7th or 8th, you just miss out. Isn't that right?
I think that's probably right. If you put this wild card round in, we go back to having a top 6 because the top 6 they get the week off and have a huge advantage. And if you're gonna win from 7 to 10, you've got to what have you got to win? 5 on the trot. To win a flag. You're
going to have to win 5 in the trot. I mean, there is an argument, I suppose, that you could get some momentum up and charge into the finals. But
I mean, it's not very often they can win 4 on the trot to win a flag, but winning 5, really, not going to happen.
I mean, I just think, the AFL, the great gaslighters that they are searching for ever higher ratings. Results, Jack, a disaster for Carlton. 7 added to their injury list, including the 2 talls. they've been tipped out of the 8 by a very, very good Hawthorn. They are coming good at the right time, and they are a very young, talented side
and fast.
Yeah, really quick. I think Carlton were very, very exposed for leg speed in and around the middle. They were very good Hawthorn, and they will do some damage in there. There's a few other sides in the 8 wavering. But I think
the Hawks have Richmond and North Melbourne to finish off with, so they'll play finals.
Yeah, if you're a Hawthorn barrack, they will play finals. If you're a Hawthorn supporter, you might just want a little bit of a tougher contest. I mean, North will give them a good contest, and I think Richmond are very good at the contest themselves, but they don't have enough weapons to kick goals. We did mention the retirement of Dusty Martin last week, wonderful champion of the game, and true to form, didn't say a word to anyone. But for mine, the big story of the week, Jack, was Sydney's win over Collingwood. Just came from the clouds. I was watching the game 5 minutes into the last quarter. I'm thinking, Sydney haven't got a hope here. They just didn't look like they were playing well enough. Then Isaac Heeney bobs up. I think he had 13 for the quarter.
He and Warner had 14 each and both kicked a goal.
Yeah, Warner also lifted, but it was Heeney just as an observer of the game without sort of looking at stats too much, that he just basically put the side on the shoulders. It reminded me a lot of Anthony Kurtafiti's last quarter in the 1999 preliminary final. It was a stunning performance. They blew Collingwood away, essentially killed their finals hopes. And got Sydney's season back on form. Isaac Heeney, and yes, there were others, but Heeney and the number one basically just said, we're going to rebuild our season today, right now, and a bit of winning form's going to help them out. They've got a few injuries. They definitely miss Papley. Whenever the ball hits the ground in their forward line, they get a bit, you just, if Papley was there, he'd swoop on it and kick a goal, but they definitely miss him. But I think he'll be back within a week or two with the finals break. NRL, we have that 8th position. Maybe they should go down the mode of having the finals in the NRL because you've got that 8th spot that no one seems to want. And it's currently filled by the Dolphins. They've moved up. The Raiders are also in it too. The Dragons had a bit of a shocker on the weekend. Meanwhile, you've got the Sharks, Storm, Penrith, and the Roosters. The top 4 look pretty much that doesn't look like any side in the bottom half of the 8 are going to bother them. And Wallabies, Jack, under the new coach, had a bit of a reality check with a 33-7 defeat at the hands of South Africa at Lang Park.
It was unwatchable.
Wasn't I didn't watch the game. But what do you make of the coach? I kind of like him in the bits I've seen.
Yeah, well, it's early days. He looks okay.
Yeah, he got a lot of work to do, of course. They're starting from a pretty low base. All right. And finally, Jack, to the Olympics. What were your highlights? The boxing?
Jessica Hull in the 1500.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, and she won a silver, but she came up against an outright champion, one of the greatest athletes of the modern era.
And the 1500 has a lot of competitors, and it's very hard to win. That was a great performance.
It's probably the toughest middle distance run. Of course, we had the Ethiopian win the marathon, win the men's marathon, and breakdancing, Jack. With the Ray Gun, Dr. Rachel Gunn performed there too. I think found a bit of shock and horror early on, but I think everyone sort of understands now that breakdancing was probably not a very good idea to introduce into the Olympic Games in the first place. And then when it did, there were no real governing bodies in any of the countries around the world who could set qualifying competitions for competitors.
I did watch the gold medalists just to have a look and see what the difference was. And I'm not much of a fan. I don't think dancing of any kind should be in the Olympics, but there was a noticeable difference, shall we say, between the gold medal performances and our Aussie.
Rachel Gunn has said this since, known as Ray Gunn, in her dancing mode. She said she couldn't beat these guys, right? And she can't beat them in Australia. So what we had was essentially the World Ballroom Dancing Association, who ran this event in Sydney, which they call the Oceanic Breakdancing Championships, and Rachel Gunn won there. And then another body grew up, but they did provide some of the contestants for Australia for the breakdancing. It won't be a sport in 28 at LA. And it was I just think it was kind of an amusing thing for the Australians. And it's great that the athletes embraced her. And it's kind of great that, that once we got over our shock at the performance, which was pretty amusing, everyone's kind of got around her as well. But great games for the Australians. But on the gold per capita list, Jack, New Zealand has won comprehensively.
Yeah,
they've had a great Olympics.
I was talking to a few Australians over the course of the fortnight, and they were giving me this per capita nonsense. And I said, "Well, have a look at New Zealand. This is embarrassing. We're well behind New Zealand."
Yeah, I can't quite remember the numbers off the top of my head.
New Zealand
one
got
per 1.5 million here, and one for about 300,000 or 400,000 in New Zealand.
New Zealand got 10 gold medals, and there's only about 4 million of them, I think.
About 4 million, and look, in some of the Caribbean islands, to St. Lucia had their first medal, and that was a gold medal in the women's 100 metres. And I think if we're looking at that per capita test, the island of Dominica with a bronze medal, Jack, and only about 30,000 people living there, I think they won that. Very amusing how the Americans were counting total medals, but not gold early on. The New York Times fell for that one. But in the end, the Americans did win on the basis of they had, I think, is it 20 gold?
Yeah, I think so.
And China 20 gold, but the US won it on a national basis by the sheer number of their silver medals. All right, well, that takes us out, Jack, unless you got something amusing for us besides something more amusing than Dr. Rachel Gunn's dance performance.
Not so much amusing as just a nice story. This is from a distinguished lawyer in London. It was on Twitter. He's talking about when he was 17, he worked in a factory in Manchester making those little plastic signs that say for sale and special offer. And the man he worked alongside was called Norbert, who had been there for decades. He was in his 60s, and he was obviously gay and didn't talk to the other workers much, probably because he was worried about – this is back in the 70s, so he was worried about getting a bit of rubbish.
Or harassed, yeah.
Yeah, or just harassed or rubbished or whatever. And Norbert told him that in the 50s, when he was a teenager living in Burnley, he had written a fan letter to Betty Grable, who was a movie star and a pin-up. And you won't know what a pin-up is, some of our listeners. It's they put a photo on that during the war. The soldiers would pin it up.
Pin-up that kept the GIs going.
Yeah.
In World War II.
And to his amazement, she wrote back. And they continued a correspondence for some years. She had a pretty tough time of it. She had a husband who was a drinker and a puncher, and her box office started to diminish. I think her last big hit was in the early 50s. And Norbert, in return, wrote to her about his job as a milkman before he started making plastic signs. In '69, she came to London to star in an ill-fated musical, and she invited him to come along. So he took his partner, and they went down to London. Not only that, she said, "I've got to come and see you." And he was living in Burnley at this stage, which is about a 4.5, 5-hour drive.
Yeah, it's at northeast, isn't it? Northeast.
So she took a limousine up to Burnley, and he had a photo of her sitting on his knee in his little terraced house in Burnley. Her health deteriorated a bit after that, and she couldn't come back to the UK. So she sent him the tickets and the money for he and his partner to go to LA and meet her. Unfortunately, she died, and all he got to visit was the grave. I just thought that was a really nice story there.
Lovely story.
Some good people out there.
All right. Well, that does take us out. And it does take us out. And Jack, I haven't quite told you this, but we'll be in a hiatus for about a month while I have a well-earned holiday. I don't go away next week, but I am pretty flat out. So it'll be about a month before we're back to you. We might try and do something from the UK, but it seems unlikely, and I won't have any kit while I'm there, microphones and things like that. As it stands with my bladder the way it is, I'm going to, be hard-pressed to get through customs anyway with all the medical stuff I have to carry. And if I had a microphone and headphones and stuff like that, I'd end up looking like possibly a terrorist/spy. So I may not take the recording kit. So that should take us out for the next month or so. By the time we get back, of course, we're just looking at in review at the Trump v. Harris debate, which will be a must-watch for anyone interested in politics generally and US politics in particular. So thank you, listeners. Look, feel free to drop us a line throughout the way. You know how to do this. We don't have to go through that all the time. You get hold of Jack on his Substack. You can get hold of me through my Twitter. I will be looking at social media, of course, while I'm away. And we'll look forward to catching up with you in mid-September. Thanks, guys. See ya.